How is it mathematically or even logically possible that a country ranks 17th from the very bottom globally in traditional human development metrics suddenly climbs the global rankings the moment we start grading countries on the health of the planet?
Right, it completely breaks the model.
It really does.
Yeah.
Today, we are looking at a paradox that just shatters our traditional definition of what we call progress. And I want you, the listener, to hold that riddle in your mind.
Because it's a huge riddle.
Yeah, we are taking a massive stack of data from the United Nations Global Human Development Reports, and this spans from 1990 all the way to 2023.
33 years of data.
Exactly. And we are putting the global average, the supposed gold standard of advancement, on trial.
And to do that effectively, we really need a foil. We are contrasting that global average with a highly illuminating case study, which is Eritrea.
Right.
We are going to look far beyond the top-level rankings because, by digging into the granular structural data, the mechanics of health, the realities of education.
And the gender equity fractures, too.
Yes, the deep fractures of gender equity and the true cost of ecological footprints. We're going to piece together what sustainable human progress actually requires.
Because a top-level ranking is often just a mask.
Right. Yeah, it's a mask for underlying dysfunction.
And that is the core pain point we're tackling in this deep dive. Does our traditional yardstick for success, the Human Development Index, inadvertently hide the massive ecological devastation caused by so-called advanced nations?
While simultaneously punishing low-energy nations.
Exactly. Are we as a global society actively rewarding the wrong behaviors? So, okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the yardstick itself.
The baseline.
Right. Before we can critique the rankings, we have to understand how the United Nations is even measuring human development in the first place.
Well, the foundational framework here is the Human Development Index, or HDI. And it was introduced back in 1990 to push back against a very dangerous, very entrenched economic assumption.
The GDP obsession.
Precisely. The idea that a country's value or progress could be measured purely by its gross domestic product.
Right, because making money doesn't mean people are living well.
Exactly. The United Nations Development Program realized that generating immense financial capital doesn't inherently capture the human experience.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, if a nation is incredibly wealthy, but its citizens are dying at age 40, or, its children have no access to schools, that wealth is essentially a mirage.
It's useless to the average person.
Right. So they built the HDI to reflect a more holistic reality.
I think the best way to visualize this framework, for you listening, is to imagine a report card, or maybe a three-legged stool of societal stability.
A three-legged stool is a great analogy.
Right. Because if any one of these three legs is too short or completely broken, the entire society tips over.
Regardless of how strong the other two legs might be.
Exactly. So picture three icons on this report card. The first leg is a heart, representing health and longevity.
Yeah.
The second leg is a graduation cap, representing knowledge.
Right.
And the third leg is a money bag, representing the standard of living.
That analogy captures the interdependency perfectly. And to put the specific data behind those three legs, the first leg, health, is measured strictly by life expectancy at birth.
Just how long you're expected to live from day one.
Exactly. Now, the second leg, knowledge, is actually measured by two distinct metrics to capture both the future and the present.
Okay, what are they?
It looks at the expected years of schooling for a young child just entering the education system. And then it looks at the actual mean years of schooling for adults age 25 and older.
So it measures what a society plans to do versus what it has actually achieved.
You nailed it. And that third leg, the standard of living, that's where the economics come back in, but with a very specific filter.
Right. It's measured by gross national income, or GNI per capita.
But, and this is key, looking at the sources, they don't just use a flat dollar amount.
No, they use something called purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Yes. And this is crucial for you, the listener, to understand, because otherwise the economic comparisons we are about to make just won't make sense.
So why do economists insist on adjusting this data into 2021 PPP dollars? Why not just use the exchange rate?
Because a flat exchange rate tells you almost nothing about human survival. Purchasing power parity exists because, well, $2,000 spends very differently depending on where you are standing on the globe.
Right. $2,000 in New York is rent for a week, maybe.
Exactly. If we just convert local currency to US dollars, it completely ignores the local cost of living. PDP adjusts the data, so we are looking at the actual equivalent cost of a basic basket of goods.
Like the cost of a loaf of bread.
The cost of a loaf of bread, the cost of a routine doctor's visit, the cost of a bus ticket. It levels the economic playing field.
So we can actually compare the true purchasing power of an individual in New York with an individual in Asmara.
Right. It prevents us from getting distracted by currency fluctuations and forces us to look at actual lived financial reality.
Okay, so if we take this three-legged stool, the health, knowledge, and PPP adjusted income, and we apply it to the entire world as one aggregate entity, what is the macro story over the last 3 decades?
Well, the trajectory of the global baseline is undeniably one of massive acceleration.
It's been going up.
Definitely. In 1990, the global HDI was 0.60. By 2023, it had seen a steady, unmistakable rise to 0.756.
Wow. But looking at the curve in the data, it's not like a perfectly linear slope, right?
No, it's not.
The most rapid global growth, the really steep part of the climb, occurred right around the turn of the millennium.
Yes, between 2000 and 2010.
Right. In 2000, the global HDI was at 0.651, and by 2010, it hit 0.707.
That single decade represents a phenomenal global lift.
What drove that? Why that specific 10-year window?
That 10-year window reflects a very specific era of international coordination. It was the era of the Millennium Development Goals.
Oh, right, the MDGs.
Yes. We saw massive, unprecedented global health initiatives rolling out across the developing world.
Like HIV treatments.
Exactly. The widespread distribution of antiretroviral therapies for HIV completely altered the mortality curves in sub-Saharan Africa.
Oh.
And we saw immense international pressure and funding directed toward expanding primary education.
So it was a decade of intense, focused momentum.
Where global capital was actively deployed to lengthen those specific legs of the stool.
But the progress isn't bulletproof.
Not at all.
If we look closely at the period right around 2019 to 2021, the curve physically breaks. The global HDI regressed from 0.745 down to 0.742.
Which is an incredibly rare statistical event.
It really is.
It reflects the worldwide shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is really one of the only times in the 33-year history of the index where global human development actually slid backward.
Because of the massive loss of life and the economic shutdowns.
Right. That dip was driven by a brutal combination of sudden drops in life expectancy and severe economic contractions that locked millions out of the labor force.
But zooming out, the 33-year trend from 0.60 to 0.756 remains a story of aggregate triumph.
Yes, on average, the world is much better off.
But aggregate triumph is dangerous.
It is a statistical smoothing mechanism.
Right. If the global trend is so overwhelmingly positive over 33 years, does that mean this rising tide is lifting all boats equally?
Not even close.
Or are some boats anchored to the ocean floor, taking on water, and they're just completely masked by the rising average?
That's the problem with averages. The global average is merely a composite sketch.
Yeah.
To understand the actual friction of development, the structural roadblocks that prevent a society from thriving, we really have to look away from the middle and examine the margins.
Which brings us to the raw reality of Eritrea. We are taking the magnifying glass off the global average and dropping it directly onto their 2023 baseline.
And it is a stark contrast.
The raw data shows Eritrea with an HDI value of 0.503.
Placing that 0.503 into the global context, out of the 203 countries and territories ranked globally by the UN, Eritrea sits at 188th.
Wow.
That is 17th from the absolute bottom.
17th. So that places the nation in the bottom 7.4% of the world for human development.
That is a profoundly challenging starting point.
It really is.
Yeah.
And to understand why that number is so low, we have to look directly at the economic bottleneck. The third leg of their stool, the money bag, is fundamentally fractured.
Very fractured.
Eritrea's 2023 per capita gross national income is $2,029. And again, that's measured in that 2021 purchasing power parity we just discussed.
Right. And to put that in perspective, the global average is $20,327.
That is roughly a tenfold gap in purchasing power.
It's massive. An HDI of 0.503 is not merely a low score on a spreadsheet. It is a manifestation of deeply entrenched structural poverty.
Right.
When a society operates on roughly 1/10 of the global average income, the velocity of progress basically grinds to a halt.
Because capital is the lubricant of development.
Exactly. Without it, day-to-day survival fundamentally supersedes any capacity for long-term societal investment.
Let's extrapolate what a 10x wealth gap actually means on the ground. Because, abstract numbers can numb the listener to the reality.
They really can.
Operating on $2,000 a year per person compared to $20,000 means that building national infrastructure is an exercise in extreme scarcity.
Absolutely.
Every single bag of cement required for a new hospital wing is 10 times harder to procure. Every microscope for a university science lab is 10 times harder to source.
And trying to keep your professionals in the country is a nightmare.
Right. Attempting to pay competitive living salaries to keep your trained doctors, engineers, and teachers inside your borders becomes a desperate battle against international brain drain.
The lack of capital triggers these immense cascading failures across every single sector of society.
And that lack of capital creates a terrifying vulnerability to external forces, too.
Oh, without a doubt. The historical data for Eritrea illustrates this fragility perfectly. In 2008, their GNI didn't just dip, it plummeted.
It plummeted sharply to 1,381 PPP dollars per capita.
That is a brutal economic contraction.
It is. And to be absolutely clear to you, the listener, our mission today is to look at this strictly through the lens of the data.
Right, we have to stay objective.
We are impartially analyzing the structural vulnerability reflected in the UN reports. We're doing this entirely separate from the internal political governance or administration of the nation.
Because the numbers tell their own story.
Right. And what that 2008 drop mathematically proves is that when your economic baseline is already operating at the absolute margins of sustenance, an external shock doesn't just result in a standard recession.
No, a standard recession implies a tightening of belts.
A drop to $1,381 implies a fundamental disruption to basic human caloric intake and survival.
It is the stark difference between an advanced economy absorbing a shock with a massive financial safety net and a structurally challenged economy walking a tightrope with no net whatsoever.
That profound economic scarcity is the heavy, undeniable anchor we have to keep in mind as we analyze the rest of their development metrics.
Yes, keep that $2,029 number in your head.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting.
The paradox.
Yes. You would naturally assume that with a tenfold wealth gap and a constant battle for basic capital, every other metric on the report card would be equally desolate.
It stands to reason. If you can't afford cement, you can't build hospitals.
And if you can't build hospitals, your people shouldn't be living very long.
Right.
But if we look exclusively at the first leg of the stool, the health longevity data, a completely different, almost miraculous story emerges.
It is arguably the most striking statistical contradiction in this entire data set.
It really threw me when I saw it.
In 1990, Eritrea's life expectancy at birth was a mere 49.7 years.
An entire society averaging a lifespan of less than 50 years. That's heartbreaking.
But by 2023, that metric has surged to 68.6 years?
Let that sink in. That is a leap of nearly 19 years added to the average lifespan, achieved in just 33 years of elapsed history.
It is staggering.
It physically outpaces the passage of time.
The rate of acceleration is just phenomenal. Now, 68.6 years still trails the global average.
Right. The global average currently sits at 73.4 years.
True. But the speed of progress in Eritrea, adding essentially 2 decades of life in 3 decades of time, vastly outpaces the average growth rate of the rest of the world.
Think about the human reality of adding 19 years to a life. That is not just a marginal improvement on a spreadsheet.
No, it's life-changing.
That is handing an individual an entirely new chapter of existence. It is a whole extra generation of time to know your grandchildren, to build a community, to pass down institutional memory.
It reshapes the entire society.
But this circles back to the paradox. How does a country with 1/10 of the global wealth pull off a public health miracle of that magnitude?
Right, because they don't have the money bags.
Exactly.
Well, this phenomenon requires us to understand the mechanics of what public health experts call catching up across the life cycle.
Okay, unpack that for us.
When a nation moves its statistical life expectancy from the high 40s up into the high 60s, it is rarely because they were developing groundbreaking geriatric care.
Or building expensive, state-of-the-art oncology wings for their senior citizens.
Exactly, because that requires the heavy capital, the $20,000 money bag they simply don't have.
So where does the jump come from?
That specific mathematical jump from 49 to 68 almost universally stems from massive systemic victories at the very beginning of the life cycle.
So infant mortality.
Yes, you raise the average by conquering early childhood mortality. We are talking about basic, highly targeted public health interventions.
Like vaccines.
The logistical triumph of establishing cold chain distribution networks to get vital vaccines into remote villages.
Hmm.
The cultural and physical rollout of insecticide-treated mosquito nets to drastically suppress malaria fatalities.
Right, and clean water.
Exactly. The engineering of basic clean water and sanitation initiatives to prevent diarrheal diseases, which are absolutely catastrophic for infants.
So when you stop vast numbers of infants and toddlers from dying of entirely preventable causes, the statistical average of the entire nation's lifespan just rockets upward.
You aren't adding 20 years to the end of an 80-year-old's life.
You are saving a 1-year-old who now gets the opportunity to live to be 68.
It's the maximum human return on investment for fundamental low-cost interventions. It is the definition of public health efficiency.
That makes so much sense.
However, the data introduces a critical caveat that prevents us from viewing this entirely through rose-colored glasses.
Well, there's always a catch with averages.
Right. The UN sources apply a metric called the inequality-adjusted HDI, or iHDI.
And this acts as a statistical reality check. Because, the standard life expectancy number of 68.6 is an average. And averages assume that all achievements are distributed perfectly evenly across every single citizen.
Which is almost never the case.
Right. Adding 19 years to a statistical average doesn't mean every single person actually received those 19 years.
The iHDI mathematically discounts a nation's top-line score based on the level of internal inequality. It basically measures the geographic and social lottery of a country.
Okay.
Globally, human development suffers a 22.0% loss when accounting for all inequalities combined.
So the whole world loses about a fifth of its progress to inequality.
Yes. But if we isolate just the life expectancy metric for Eritrea, the data reveals a 19.4% loss in their HDI, specifically due to inequality in health.
Wow. And what's the global average loss in that specific category?
The global average loss for health inequality is only 12.9%.
So they are losing nearly a fifth of their health score to internal inequality, which means that a miracle leap of 19 years is highly concentrated.
Exactly. If the cold chain vaccines and the clean water initiatives are primarily clustering around urban centers or, regions with slightly better road infrastructure, the rural populations are essentially left behind.
They aren't seeing a single extra day of life while the city centers pull the national average up.
The iHDI forces us to acknowledge those disparities within a country's own borders. The rising tide is indeed lifting the boat, but we have to recognize that the lower decks are still taking on water.
That's a great way to put it.
And this concept of internal inequality serves as the perfect mechanism to transition into the next and arguably most critical dimension of our data stack.
The deep structural fractures found in education and gender equity.
Yes. If we pull out the Gender Development Index, the GDI, and contrast it with the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, the human narrative becomes incredibly complex.
Before we hit the gender split, let's look at the baseline of the second leg of our stool, which is knowledge.
The graduation cap.
Right. In Eritrea, the expected years of schooling for a child is 7.3 years. But the global average is nearly double that, at 13-point-low years.
That's the expectation.
Yes. But the mean years of schooling, the actual realized time adults have spent in a classroom, is a devastatingly low 5.1 years.
And the global average for that is 8.8 years.
So on a macro level, Eritrea is operating at roughly 56% of the global education capacity.
But the moment we apply the GDI, the gender lens, the severity of the situation really compounds.
Let's define the parameters here for the listener.
Okay, the Gender Development Index measures the parity, the balance between men and women across the three basic HDI dimensions: health, knowledge, and income.
And globally, the GDI sits at 0.955.
Right, which indicates that the world, on average, is slowly inching toward parity in these basic achievements.
A score of 1.0 would be perfect parity.
Exactly.
But the parity in Eritrea is heavily skewed. The expected years of schooling for females is 6.9, compared to the male expectation of 7.8.
It's a gap, but it's not the biggest issue.
No, the true bottleneck is the female mean years of schooling, which sits at just 4.7 years.
4 years of formal education for the average adult woman.
That is a structural roadblock to any form of economic independence. It essentially guarantees exclusion from a modernizing workforce.
It does. Yet within this GDI data, we see another physiological paradox.
What paradoxes?
Always. Female life expectancy in Eritrea is 70.7 years, which is notably higher than the male life expectancy of 66.5 years.
Which, to be fair, aligns with global biological norms. Women generally outlive men.
True. But that 4-year gap in life expectancy in Eritrea is actually a wider divergence than the global baseline.
It is. But I mean, outliving your male counterparts does not equate to a high quality of life if your formal education stopped in the 4th grade.
Not at all. And to truly comprehend the female experience here, we have to transition from the GDI to the GII.
The Gender Inequality Index.
Right, because the GII doesn't just measure parity in basic achievements, it measures the cost of inequality.
Specifically focusing on reproductive health, political empowerment, and labor market participation.
Exactly. And the global GII value has been improving. It went from 0.52 back in 1993 down to 0.455 in 2023.
But the reproductive health data for Eritrea is incredibly heavy.
Oh.
We need to talk about the maternal mortality ratio, the MMR.
It's a tough metric to look at.
The global average is 216.1 deaths per 100,000 live births. Eritrea's MMR is currently 321.6, so it remains significantly elevated above the global norm.
The current snapshot is elevated, yes, but historical context is everything. We really must look at where they started. The sources show that in 1990, Eritrea's MMR was an apocalyptic 1,318.9 deaths per 100,000 live births.
I really want to put that 1990 number into perspective, because 1,318 per 100,000 means that well over 1% of all pregnancies resulted in the death of the mother.
It's a staggering loss of life.
In a society with high fertility rates, where a woman might have 4, 5, or 6 children, her lifetime compounding risk of dying in childbirth was massive.
It means that in a single generation, virtually every family, every village, was intimately, directly acquainted with the tragedy of maternal death.
It wasn't an anomaly, it was an expected, terrifying outcome of building a family.
It completely dictates the psychological fabric of a society.
So to bring that ratio down from 1,318.9 to 321.6 represents an astonishing decrease of roughly 75%.
It is a monumental public health victory that parallels their overall life expectancy leap.
They have systematically dismantled the deadliest aspects of childbirth.
Through the introduction of trained midwives, basic sterile equipment, and rural health outposts.
But, and there's always a but, that victory is immediately complicated and structurally undermined by the next data point.
The adolescent birth rate.
The ABR. Globally, the adolescent birth rate has plummeted from 74.9 in 1990 down to 39.1 today. The world is delaying childbirth.
But Eritrea's adolescent birth rate remains highly elevated, sitting at 65.2.
And this is the critical nexus where the health data and the education data violently collide, isn't it?
It is. The high adolescent birth rate of 65.2 and the deeply stunted female mean years of schooling of 4.0 are not separate statistics. They are intrinsically causally linked.
So if the adolescent birth rate is what's locking women out of that education pillar, then contraception and family planning isn't just a health initiative here, it's an absolute economic mandate.
Completely.
I want to paint a picture of what this actually looks like for a teenage girl, because this is where the data becomes a human life.
Go ahead.
The global average trajectory suggests a young woman stays in the secondary education system into her late teens. She delays childbirth, she acquires specialized skills, and she eventually enters the labor market with a significantly higher earning potential.
That's the 13 years of expected schooling playing out.
Right. But the mathematical reality in Eritrea forces a completely different trajectory. Because of that elevated ABR of 65.2, a young girl is statistically highly likely to become pregnant while still in her teenage years.
And the moment that happens, she is pulled out of the education system.
Her formal learning permanently halts at that 4.0 year mark.
Now, because of the 75% reduction in maternal mortality, the profound news is that she will likely survive that teenage childbirth.
She is healthy, and her child is alive.
But because her education was prematurely severed, she is structurally locked out of future economic empowerment. She doesn't have the knowledge leg of the stool to stand on.
Survival has been secured by the public health apparatus, but lifelong economic agency has been forfeited.
You have articulated the exact friction of their current development stage. Survival without empowerment.
It's a heavy realization.
And we see the culmination of this lack of empowerment in the political participation metrics.
Oh, the parliamentary seats.
Right. The percentage of female parliamentary seats in Eritrea has remained completely static at 22.0% for many consecutive years.
And again, maintaining strict impartiality regarding the mechanism of their government, We are just looking at the output data here.
Of course.
A static 22.0% is slightly below the global average of 26.5%, but the defining feature isn't the percentage, it is the rigidity
It doesn't fluctuate.
at all.
And that rigidity indicates a structural ceiling. The health metrics, life expectancy, maternal mortality, they're highly dynamic, moving rapidly in a positive direction.
But the empowerment metrics, the mean years of schooling, adolescent birth rates, and political representation, they are frozen.
It suggests a society that has optimized for biological survival, but has not yet developed the economic or social infrastructure to transition into societal equity.
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the comprehensive picture we have painted of Eritrea thus far.
It's a challenging picture.
You are looking at a country operating on 1/10 of the global wealth. They face massive educational hurdles, a static political structure for women, and severe gender disparities locked in place by high adolescent birth rates.
By every conventional metric of the Human Development Index, they are struggling immensely.
They are objectively in the bottom 7.4% of the world.
But
But what happens if we completely flip the script on how we define success?
this is where it gets wild.
What if the global test we are grading everyone on is fundamentally missing the most critical question of the 21st century?
This is where the narrative of human development undergoes a complete radical inversion.
Let's talk about it.
In recent years, data scientists, economists, and environmentalists realized that the traditional HDI had a fatal structural flaw.
It treated the Earth as an infinite expendable resource.
Exactly. The traditional index rewarded nations for generating immense financial wealth and building massive, sprawling infrastructure, but it completely ignored the ecological devastation, the carbon emissions, and the resource extraction required to achieve that status.
Enter the pHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The game changer.
This is the disruptive metric. This is the plot twist of our deep dive.
It really is. The pHDI essentially acts as an ecological audit of the traditional HDI.
It aggressively penalizes nations for high carbon emissions and massive material footprints. It looks at the advanced nations and asks, sure, your standard of living is exceptionally high, but did you irreversibly destroy the biosphere to get there?
And the mechanics of this adjustment are vital to understand, because how do UN scientists measure a material footprint?
It isn't just a measure of the trash a country produces, right?
No, not at all. It calculates the raw materials extracted globally. The lithium mined in South America, the rare earth metals pulled from Central Africa, the concrete poured, the agricultural runoff generated specifically to meet a single nation's consumption demands.
So it tracks the entire supply chain of a highly consumed good, like an imported smartphone or a gas-guzzling vehicle, back to its planetary source, and assigns that ecological cost to the consuming nation.
Exactly. And the results of this planetary audit are breathtaking. Let's look at the gold standard global average first.
Okay.
When you adjust the global HDI score for planetary pressure, the global score is slashed by a massive 10.05%.
That is a severe systemic penalty. Over 10% of human progress just wiped out.
Because the global average is entirely driven by advanced economies whose development models are inextricably linked to burning carbon and extracting finite resources at an astonishing, unsustainable rate.
Now, contrast that with Eritrea.
This is the twist.
When subjected to the exact same rigorous ecological audit, Eritrea's score drops by a minuscule 1.39%.
A 1.39% loss versus a 10.05% loss. It barely registers on the scale.
And because of this incredibly low penalty, when the pHDI is officially applied, Eritrea actually climbs 3 spots in the global rankings.
They mathematically leapfrog other nations who are penalized heavily for their pollution.
Let's look at the raw ecological footprint data to truly comprehend this gap, because the numbers are wild.
Go for it.
Carbon dioxide emissions per capita. The global average is 4.5 tons of CO2 per person per year.
And Eritrea?
Eritrea's emissions are a mere 0.17 tons.
0.17. It is practically a statistical rounding error compared to the global north.
And the material footprint per capita, that supply chain measurement of raw extraction we just discussed, the global average is 12.7 tons of earth consumed per person.
Okay, and Eritrea is utilizing just 2.36 tons.
It's an entirely different universe of consumption.
If we map this out conceptually, imagine a graph divided to 4 quadrants.
I'm picturing it.
On the horizontal x-axis, you measure human development from low to high. On the vertical y-axis, you measure ecological pressure from low to high.
Okay, where does everyone sit?
The global average sits squarely and dangerously in the high development, high ecological pressure quadrant.
A model built entirely on consumption.
Yes. Eritrea, conversely, sits in the low development, extremely low pressure quadrant.
It's like grading a final exam, where half the class got an A, but to get that A, they broke into the school at night, stole the answer key, left the water running to flood the hallways, and caused tens of thousands of dollars in permanent property damage.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Right. Meanwhile, another student got a D on the test, but they sat quietly at their desk, used their own pencil, and didn't break a single rule.
And once the school administration factors in the cost of the property damage, the grades suddenly look entirely different.
The A students aren't just advanced. They are in massive debt to the school.
The traditional HDI only graded the ink on the test paper. The pHDI grades the damage done to the classroom to produce that test paper.
But, okay, I have to push back here.
Go ahead.
Because we have to be intellectually honest about why their footprint is so low.
Right.
Is this fair to praise them? Like, is Eritrea maintaining 0.17 tons of carbon on purpose? Are they a nation of pioneering, highly conscious eco-warriors?
That's the big question.
Or is this just passive efficiency because they simply lack the heavy industry, the mega factories, the sprawling highways, and that 10x wealth that drives modern consumption?
That is the ultimate philosophical debate triggered by this data set. And the analytical reality is that, yes, it is primarily passive efficiency.
They just don't have the means to pollute.
You cannot emit carbon from coal plants you haven't built yet. You do not have a 12-ton material footprint if your population simply cannot afford to import massive amounts of single-use consumer goods or electronics.
So a skeptic would say this is just structural poverty masquerading as environmental sustainability.
A skeptic would definitely say that. But that cynical view completely misses the deeper, more urgent insight here.
Which is
Even if Eritrea's low footprint is passive, their data acts as a mirror, exposing the deeply dangerous, highly unsustainable reality of the advanced world.
it exposes the A students.
Yes. It forces us to confront a terrifying mathematical truth. If the global average, which is the exact goal every developing nation is supposedly striving to reach, results in a 10% ecological penalty that is actively destabilizing the climate.
Then that goal is inherently fatally flawed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
True human advancement cannot fundamentally require the destruction of the biosphere that sustains human life.
So what does this all mean? How do we synthesize all this? We have a 10x wealth gap, an incredible 19-year lifespan miracle built on cold chain vaccines, deeply fractured education and adolescent birth rates, and an almost non-existent carbon footprint.
It's a lot of conflicting data.
It is. How do we turn this massive contradictory stack of sources into a cohesive roadmap for the future?
Well, we have to distill the data into sustainable, actionable paths. We have to redefine the future of development based on what the numbers tell us actually works and what needs urgent intervention.
So what's the roadmap for Eritrea?
For Eritrea, the data outlines a very clear three-step strategic roadmap.
Let's build that roadmap. Based on the friction we identified in the GDI and GII, the first priority has to be education and the economic bottleneck.
Precisely. First priority. Elevate education and basic income. The government must specifically target and dismantle that 4.0 mean years of schooling for females.
Because you can't build a modern economy without them.
You cannot build a resilient, diversified economy if half of your adult population is structurally forced to exit the education system before middle school. The knowledge leg of the stool requires massive, concentrated capital investment.
Which flows directly into priority number 2.
Yeah.
Because you can't fix the schooling without fixing the health mechanics that pull those girls out of the classroom in the first place.
Right, the health focus. Eritrea has already proved they can execute complex public health logistics by adding 19 years to life expectancy and slashing maternal mortality by 75%.
They have the administrative capacity for health miracles.
Now, the battle must shift from mere survival to reproductive empowerment. They must focus heavily on lowering that adolescent birth rate of 65.2.
Expanding access to family planning is not just a health initiative.
No, it is the quickest, most mathematically sound path to freeing up young women to complete their education, enter the formal labor force, and begin closing that 10x wealth gap.
And the third priority. This is where the paradox of the pHDI comes back into play.
The third is model preservation. As Eritrea's standard of living inevitably rises, as they succeed in building more hospitals, paving more roads, and keeping girls in school, they must consciously avoid the high-emission trap of the global average.
They have a completely unique, historically rare opportunity to leapfrog the fossil fuel-intensive industrial revolution that the global north relied upon and move straight into clean energy pathways.
Solar, wind, geothermal, sustainable agriculture. They have the potential to build a high HDI society while remaining anchored in that low ecological pressure quadrant.
They can deliberately engineer a society that keeps their pHDI penalty at 1.39% while aggressively moving their base HDI score up.
That would be the ultimate success story.
But I want to connect this directly back to you, the listener, because if you are sitting in an advanced economy, the lesson here isn't just a roadmap for Eritrea, it is a profound warning for the global north.
It really is.
Can we learn from the incredibly low material footprint of the global south? Can an advanced economy learn to completely decouple human well-being from endless material extraction?
That is the defining challenge of our era.
Yeah.
The Global South is actively learning from the health and education frameworks of the North. We see that in the lifespan leap.
Right.
But the North desperately needs to learn resource efficiency and a material restraint from the South. The old metaphor of development was a seesaw. We pushed human metrics up by pushing planetary health down.
But we can't play on that seesaw anymore.
No, we need to upgrade the entire operating system of global development. We need to learn how to run a high-welfare, high-education society on low-resource hardware.
We have to elevate the entire apparatus together. Yeah. You raise the human condition without lowering the ecological baseline.
A delicate but necessary balance beam.
Well, we've spent this time thoroughly unpacking the incredible, multifaceted paradox of Eritrea.
It's been a journey.
A nation fighting severe, uphill structural battles in education and wealth. A nation that managed to pull off a genuine logistical miracle by adding 19 years to their life expectancy.
And a nation surviving with an ecological footprint that puts the heavily penalized developed world to absolute shame. The UN data clearly reveals that there is no single perfect model of development existing on Earth right now.
No.
The North has the capital and the education. The South has the ecological balance. Everyone holds a piece of the puzzle.
Which leaves me with one final thought for you to mull over. We constantly use this patronizing terminology in global economics. We say we want developing nations to catch up to the rest of the world.
We hear it all the time.
But looking at that massive 10% ecological penalty the rest of the world is currently paying, looking at the sheer amount of property damage we've done to the classroom to get our A grade,
It makes you wonder.
you have to critically ask yourself, are we absolutely sure we want them catching up to us? Or do we, in the global north, urgently need to start catching up to their ecological footprint?
A vital, necessary question for the future of the index.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the top-line numbers never tell the whole story. Data drives decisions, but insight opens the future. Keep questioning the yardstick. We'll see you next time.